Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of The Crossroads. I am your host, Rashida Green, and this is the show for and about environmental justice and those who fight the fight with skin as melanated as the days are long. Knowledge is power, and we are breaking down stereotypes one episode at a time. So for this episode, we are looking at incinerators, how they impact health for humans, how they're impacting the environment. We're going to take a look at a specific incinerator in the state of Maryland. We're going to talk about the oxygen cycle and just some general impacts of carbon emissions. And, another thing we're going to talk about too is dispelling some myths. So there's one particular myth about certain incinerators or incinerator companies being waste to energy. Yeah, we cutting through all that cheese. Getting into incinerators. So an incinerator is in essence a furnace for burning trash. The EPA defines them as municipal waste combustors or municipal waste combustor unit. And it's considered to be any equipment that combusts solid, liquid, or gas. And the specific corresponding reactions that these facilities have, or these other names for them, are also places for gasification and plasma arc facilities. They're all considered to be incinerators. And there's actually a variety of different types of trash to be incinerated, such as medical waste, which is an entirely different thing. So incinerators are using this term waste to energy to imply that they are emitting less harmful chemicals into the atmosphere, and also to say that they are providing energy for our infrastructure, right? However, the amount of energy that they produce for powering homes is very, very small. It is a very small fraction of the actual total energy that it takes to power homes on a regular basis. In the U.S., there's a dependence on landfills as the main method for disposing of waste. We do have incinerators as well. In contrast, in Europe, countries like Denmark and Germany have embraced incinerators as a preferred method for waste removal. And the EU wants more of these quote unquote waste to energy plants. So we're going to go back to America. Let's take a specific example of an incinerator in Baltimore called Wheelabrator or Wheelabrator or We Lab Like to Lie. Anyway, so this incinerator was built in 1986 and is located on Russell Street in Baltimore. And for anyone who's driven to Baltimore, driven through it on your way up and down 95, you've noticed the giant smokestack. Yeah, that's that incinerator. So it is in the middle of a residential community, and it burns about 700,000 tons of waste every year. Half of which comes from Baltimore residents, and the rest that comes from other counties in Maryland, the surrounding area. And it's actually considered to be the largest polluter in the city. And the second is Grace Chemical Plant. We'll put a pin in that because we might come back to that one a little bit later on. In 2005, Baltimore had the highest level of air pollution. And some of the chemicals that this particular incinerator emits, if you will, nitrogen oxide, lead, and mercury. And Baltimore has 2 trash incinerators, this one, and Curtis Bay Energy, who has the largest medical waste incinerator in the country. Yeah. In 2019, the Baltimore City Council passed a law that limited emissions. Basically, it's the Baltimore Clean Air Act. And it was touted as basically going to bring an end to trash burning in the city. And they also passed some non-binding resolutions wanting to get away from, so much dependence on landfills and burning trash, and looking into developing a zero waste plan and also increasing the recycling. And Catherine Pugh, the former mayor of Baltimore, signed the bill in March of 2019. So no surprise, the incinerator company sued the city and put out a lot of propaganda to folks talking about the benefits of the incinerator. And part of it is this waste to energy myth, and also that this is a better form of emissions because it's not methane that you'd find in landfills, which is considered to be more harmful. It's not that, it's something else. And that argument is also false. We haven't gotten there quite yet, but we'll get there. Getting back to the lawsuit, so this had gone to federal court, and it was found that the city council's law, the Clean Air Act, was actually in conflict with state law. And right now, the city council is appealing. And I bring this up to show what power your city council persons have, your city council members have, and should feel empowered to do. And quite frankly, if they ain't moving like that in your city, you need to get rid of them. So let's shift a little bit and think about some of the larger global initiatives that we as a world have tried to come together and get signed, starting with the Kyoto Protocol. This was the first legally binding document for climate change that was passed in 1997. And the goal was for industrial nations agreed to cut greenhouse gas by 5% on 1990 emission levels between 2008 and 2012. Interestingly, at the time, China was classified as a developing nation along with India, Brazil, and South Africa, and they weren't going to be placed under these restrictions because they were considered to be, still developing. Yeah. Okay. So in the U.S., it was voted down by the Senate during the Clinton administration, and George W. Bush withdrew U.S. support in 2002. And basically, that allowed for the U.S. and China, who are the world's largest carbon polluters, to do whatever they want without any regulations at all. So there's, interestingly, in the research that I've done, it's some conflicting reports. So on one hand, you see reports saying that carbon emission was actually cut from 1990 levels by 22%. And some of that was attributed to, for example, the United Kingdom emissions were reduced because they switched from coal to gas. But the thing that I want to emphasize about both of these is that these are non-renewable energy sources, which means that once they're gone, they're gone. So once we run out of coal, that's it. We have to find a new source of energy. And coal takes a long time to form. So the fact is that we've in our extractive practices are really removing things from the earth that have been here for a long ass time. And the only way to get any of it back is to allow the carbon cycle, which I didn't touch on in this episode, but which is an overlapping cycle. And I mentioned this before, that a lot of these cycles, these biogeochemical cycles, overlap. So, and I'm talking about the oxygen cycle, or I will very soon, but that has some overlap with the carbon cycle. And I'm not going to get into too deep about coal. I can in the future. Just suffice to say that it is non-renewable. We're not getting it back anytime soon. In 2015, as more reports show, the carbon emission actually increased And this was due to development in China and India. And remember, back in when the Kyoto Protocol was passed, China was still classified as a developing nation and didn't have to sign on to be a part of the legally binding contract to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So they just didn't do it. Yeah. So the issue with the Kyoto Protocol is really that it's considered to be a kind of a failure, and that it really hasn't done much of anything to change anything. And these are summits and organized events that are happening on a regular basis. You know, for another example, there's the Copenhagen Climate Summit, which, you know, again is an example, specifically the one that was held in 2009. And that was supposed to address the issues of the rising global temperature. And so for those who are not aware, there's a global temperature. And if you've ever heard of, I recommend checking out someone named Naomi Klein. She's written several books about climate change. And as she and other environmentalists say, and believe very strongly, that if the global temperature continues to rise, so if it rises to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, that we're going to suffer some major losses of life of all kinds. It's just going to be it's like the doomsday clock. And so the purpose of this particular summit was to address that, but no agreement could be reached. So I bring these things up. I bring up the Copenhagen Summit. I bring up the Kyoto Protocol and the lack of involvement from the U.S. and from China as well, and other countries too, because there was no these things are only as effective as the countries that join. And it's good if smaller nations are doing it, but we need the larger countries that are like America and like China to come to the table too. So these attempts have all been in vain. So we're looking at what's trying to be accomplished on an international level. Let's take it to science and let's talk about the oxygen cycle. And so as I mentioned before, this process, the oxygen cycle, intersects with the carbon cycle, nitrogen, and the water cycle. And the oxygen cycle maintains oxygen levels by moving it through the atmosphere, which is the layer of gas above the Earth's surface, the lithosphere, which is the Earth's crust, and that's actually the largest oxygen reservoir, and lastly, the biosphere, and that's the ecosystem. And the stages of this cycle involve photosynthesis, and that's where plants are releasing oxygen back into the atmosphere as a byproduct. All aerobic organisms use oxygen to breathe, and that's called respiration. And when animals exhale, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere for plants to absorb. And for the bonus points, for the real science nerds out there, and when I discussed the water cycle, I talked about transpiration, which is where plants absorb the water and release it as water vapor back into the atmosphere, and that's transpiration. So you see, we have plants playing a very central part in two different cycles. Also, plants are involved in the nitrogen cycle as well. Oxygen is used for decomposition. So that's when something dies or an organism dies and the organic matter returns back to the soil and the air. And oxygen is needed for the release of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Oxygen is also used for rusting. Rusting is what happens when there's oxidation, where oxygen reacts with metals, and that causes the rust. Breathing, as we mentioned, and combustion, which is burning organic material, which releases carbon dioxide. And oxygen is reserved in the atmosphere, biosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. So why am I telling you this? What is all of this? So we're at the crossroads. Global warming is human-induced. The use of incinerators to burn trash or landfills to hold trash both send carbon into the atmosphere in excess. So we already have what we need. We have natural processes that utilize carbon dioxide, so there is a balance. And by our interference, we have offset that balance. We are experiencing a latent effect of the last 2 decades of us burning stuff and drilling the oil and doing all the things. So we're starting to see the ramifications of all of that human foolishness. And, some of the more realistic, concrete changes that we're going to see, or we are already seeing, as I mentioned when we talked about the water cycle, that the oceans absorb carbon dioxide. And however, because of it being in excess, and other reasons other methods in which we're damaging the water, it's causing it to acidify. So that means that there's more, that the pH of the water of the ocean is changing. And that is going to impact sea life because it impacts anything that's got calcium carbonate. So that's shells, coral reef. And as this continues, the organisms that can move will and create new ecosystems someplace else, but coral can't move. So you hear people talking about the bleaching of the coral. That's because the ocean is becoming more acidic. And also talking about threats to human life. One of the ramifications of global warming is melting, and melting causes the sea levels to rise. So that's another big thing, a big concern, particularly for coastal cities. So when we're talking about coastal cities, and again, this is global impact we're talking about. So we're not going to just be talking about America. Yes, New Orleans and Miami are examples of cities that would be impacted, but so would Manila or Melbourne or Tokyo or Venice. All of these coastal cities could be adversely impacted or wiped out if there's any in crazy weather. And we know we've seen it. We've been seeing it. These super hurricanes, the hurricane season starting and ending later than it used to. All these things are all contributed to global warming. And reeling it back into the United States, that we've been burning trash in this country since the 1800s. There are in total 86 incinerators in 25 states in the U.S., and they burn 29 million tons of waste. And the amount of energy that they claim to output is really marginal, as I mentioned. And just to kind of bring it home again about the argument that a lot of these companies use, and also the rationale that states use. In Maryland, trash burning is unfortunately classified as a source of renewable energy. Yeah. So that's not good. And it's not gonna work. It's still putting carbon in the atmosphere. Just because it's not methane, it's still carbon dioxide. It's still not grand. And just to extra throw a monkey wrench in there, in addition to the ocean being a method to absorb the carbon, the best place or the best resource would be plants. But we have a very serious deforestation problem. And we're cutting down trees for a myriad of reasons, Sometimes, in the US, we see it a lot for lumber that people need, for housing development. In other countries, it's for furniture. And if I'm talking about furniture, I'm looking at you, IKEA. So we're cutting down trees faster than we can renew them, faster than they can grow. Because again, these are processes that take a long time. And there's something that I didn't really get into in the previous episode when I talked about the water cycle, but there's, in the process of creating wetlands, there's also the process of eutrophication, which allows for increased diversity of a given area. So that wetland or bog could eventually become something else, could grow into trees eventually, and all of that is possible with a abundance of biodiversity. Biodiversity is what makes ecosystems possible and what keeps them thriving and growing. Going back down to Black folks specifically. Black people are more likely to suffer from asthma due to adverse living conditions, and that includes mold, air pollution, pesticides. Communities of color are also more likely to live in areas with overwhelming environmental burdens. And we've talked about that before, so it shouldn't be a surprise where the Baltimore Incinerator is located, that the community around it is predominantly African American. A man described the smell of it in the morning, the overall haze in the sky. And we've mentioned that Baltimore had a very serious pollution problem not too long ago. And we also have to really call more into the race and the class aspects too. Because I did a really, I took a really interesting turn as I was preparing for the show. I actually found this really interesting article that really talked about the Curtis Bay area of Maryland. And they were actually interested in getting a new incinerator back in 2009. And they actually, the residents at the time, and when I say this, I'm talking about white residents, were really interested in having jobs brought back to the community and hoping for a shift, meaning that they wanted to have more of the same, more white people living in their neighborhood, and, made the statement that I found very interesting, which was that the environment wasn't safe, but the neighborhood was. And I think what gives me the most pause about that statement, and the person who wrote this, her name was Chloe Amman, and it was I'll put the link, and it was really interesting, like the coded language that she said she had to adjust to when people talked about the presence, I'm using air quotes, of people of color in a white neighborhood and the response. Now this is 2009. This is not the 50s. And the reason that I'm bringing this up, ever so important topic of, the interesting things that no matter what structure we're talking about, if we're talking about laws, if we're talking about, the workplace, if we're talking about our communities where we live in our environment, you see how it's very interesting how some people think that it's more important for them to live in an area that is causing pollution or has the likelihood of endangering the environment, so long as everyone looks the same. Again, this was in 2009. So I just wanted to raise that up real quick. No, we already know, for those who listen to the show, how I get down. So I don't need to get into all the deets about that, but you can kind of see it. Hopefully it's obvious. And going back to the law, the government considers, as I mentioned, for that incinerator to be a renewable source of energy by burning trash. This is also a popular practice, as I mentioned, in the UK. And they're looking to invest in more of these types of facilities. Now, there have to be other solutions, and I do think that the Baltimore City Council was on the road to that. So if we're talking about what are some solutions to these issues, first of all, shout out to the Baltimore City Council, and shout out to everybody in Baltimore who made certain that those were the folks that you voted for. And if you like it, I love it. Keep the pressure on them. If there's somebody that's kind of slipping, let them know, like, hey man, you can get replaced. Okay. Like, keep the pressure on. And also, if there are other states that are looking for a model like what Baltimore's City Council has done, these are the kinds of folks you need to have as your council representatives. Like, these are the folks. So you need to be really paying attention to the signs in the yard, the ads on TV that come on that interrupt Judge Judy. You need to watch that so that you can get familiar with who wants to represent you and if they represent your interests. And since we're on the subject of voting, let's very quickly talk about some of the upcoming primaries, because I remember the last time I did primaries, I don't think I named everyone that was coming down in June 23rd. I was just trying to keep the window very narrow, but now I got to open it back up. So today is June 15th, a quite lovely day, I might add. But today is June 15th. Okay. So here are the upcoming primaries. So we have a litany on June 23rd. Kentucky, Mississippi, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia. June 30th, Colorado, Oklahoma, and Utah. And July 7th, just for kicks, Delaware and New Jersey. And you can go to ncsl.org. That's where I got all these dates from. They break it down by year. If it's a runoff, whatever it is, they give it to you. They give you the info. And I know I didn't get into so much of like the science deets as far as what are some scientific solutions to burning trash. And I will, because this is just going to be the appetizer episode. But I wanted to put this out to kind of change the subject. The last couple of episodes have been really, really heavy. So I wanted to switch to something that was a little bit more positive, still very much so like something that had, a lot of work to be done. Still like, yeah, I just wanted to change the mood a little bit. I just didn't want to have to like talk about anything too heavy. At least like the Baltimore City Council made me feel like I could cheer a little bit. So I just wanted to give an example of what it looks like when the elected officials do what the F they were supposed to do. Okay? So this was just a big up for them. Actually, and I forgot to give flowers. But actually, you know what? I'm going to give flowers to the Baltimore City Council. Done. You see that? Other shout outs for this show. As always, this episode of The Crossroads is brought to you by the Black Pod Collective. You can follow them at BLKPOD Collective on Instagram. Shout out to Glitz and Gems for launching an Etsy page. You can check out all of her amazing products, her scrubs, her sprays, all shaped like beautiful gems. You can follow her and check out her amazing products on @_glitz in gems with the 2 Z's and 2 underscores. Meow Hive joined me in thanking Purring Kitty Cat for having me as her catnip last week. Thank you so much for that shout out. And also look out for the latest episode of Confessions from a Red Couch. She and I, Janae, were nerding out, and I was giving really terrible love advice because that is not my forte. But please check that out. Please check. I think that's going to be out on, I think she said on Wednesday or Thursday of this week. So please check that out. And I, again, thank you all for joining me. I will be back to give some other solutions, some more science-based solutions to what we can do to really combat the use of incinerators. And in the meantime, again, I just encourage everybody to look at your state laws, see what they classify as renewable energy, see where the incinerator is in your community. If you don't use incinerators, because not every state has one, you're probably using landfills. Where's that landfill in conjunction with your neighborhood, or if you're living someplace? And the crazy part, again, sorry, I know I said I was getting ready to go. I lied. I'm sorry. So the interesting thing is about this too, is that in Europe, it ain't no thing. Like, they don't care about it the way that we do. Like, people literally fight to not have incinerators or not have their homes built around incinerators. But it seems like, at least with this branding, because that was another thing, like during the research for this, I kept seeing like waste to energy. I was like, what the hell is this? And I'm like, are you burning shit or not? You know? And lo and behold, yes, they were. But they want to call it something else and like try to give us the remix. No, you're still burning trash. And, you know, and right now, I honestly can say I don't even really have the answers. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was thinking, I wish we could just, like, Superman, like, if y'all ever watched that, I think it's Superman 2, where he takes all the nukes and he hauls them into the sun. That's what I was hoping we could do. Just, like, take all the garbage and just throw it in the sun. But we'd need Superman. Yes, that's not going to happen. But anyway, I will get to some solutions, okay? I promise. I will find an expert or do some deeper dive in to get more into this issue. But please keep a pulse on what's going on, particularly in Baltimore. If you're looking for a model, or if you're just looking to get behind the people that you voted for, or maybe need to get to know, now's the time. So thank you all for joining me, and I'll see you at the crossroads. Get out and get active.